On November 9th, 1973, in Washington, William Simon took control of the fuel emergency. He was not drilling oil. He was deciding who would get it. Trucks, farms, heat, industry. The shortage was no longer underground. It had moved into paperwork. One federal order could reroute millions of barrels and strand everyone else. This is not fiction. This was Washington, 1973. The formal transfer came in two steps. On November 27th, Richard Nixon signed the Emergency Petroleum Allocation Act of 1973, and on December 4, in Executive Order 11748, he created the Federal Energy Office, put Simon at the top of it, and delegated to him the authority to allocate petroleum. That is the rupture, not geology. Administration, not the missing barrel, but the hand that assigns their remaining barrel. Nixon had already warned the country on November 25th that U.S. shortages could run as high as 17%. His response tells you what Washington feared first: more heating oil, 15% less gasoline distribution, weekend station closings, lower speed limits, reduced jet fuel. In other words, the market signal was no longer enough. Priority had entered the room. Richard Nixon, Address to the Nation about National Energy Policy, 1973. And if you want to see what that feels like below the level of speeches, look at J.W. Edwards, December 3, 1973. Overland Park, Kansas. A trucker hauling meat toward New York. Near Blakesley, Pennsylvania, his tank hit empty. He grabbed his CB radio and stopped on Interstate 80. That act helped ignite the trucker shutdown. He was not trading oil futures. He was discovering the first law of shortage. The people who keep the system moving are invisible until they stop. Joseph A. Williams, When Truckers Shut Down America to Protest Oil Prices, 2019. And that is the thesis of this video. The real crisis is never simply that there is less oil. The real crisis begins when somebody has to decide whose shortage matters first. To understand why Simon mattered, you have to go back 3 weeks. Kuwait City, October 16, 1973. Ahmed Zaki Yamani was there with the other Gulf oil ministers while the war still hung over every calculation. And this is the detail most people compress into one word: embargo. As if the whole thing began and ended with ships not sailing. It did not. The first move was price. At that meeting, the producers forced through roughly a 70% increase in the posted price of crude, taking it from about $3, Euro 1 to about $5. 11 a barrel. Daniel Yergin treats that decision as the moment the old pricing order broke. The Columbia Center on Global Energy Policy makes the same point in simpler language. Before the embargo fully spread, the producers had already rewritten the terms of trade. Daniel Yergin, The Prize, 1991. Jason Bordoff and Megan O'Sullivan, The 1973 Oil Crisis. 3 crises in 1, 2023. Then came the second move. October 17. The Arab producers agreed to cut output by at least 5% a month. But read the CIA's October 19 memorandum carefully, and you see the real weapon. Not only cuts. Selection. Friendly countries could still receive normal deliveries. Others could be squeezed harder. Some could face total embargo. The memo is explicit that the language was left deliberately vague so each producer could act according to its own interests. That ambiguity was not a flaw. It was leverage. CIA Office of Economic Research, The Oil Weapon and Its Effects, 1973. So the mechanism was never just scarcity. It was discretionary scarcity. That changes everything, because once oil can be routed politically, a barrel stops being just a barrel. It becomes a signal, a threat, a favor, a bargaining chip delivered through loading schedules, destination choices, and contract language. The United States Department of State's own historical summary says the embargo both banned exports to targeted states and introduced production cuts, while years of pressure on prices and concessions had already destabilized the old system underneath it. And Yamani matters here for a second reason. He was not the cartoon version of the crisis. He was not simply shouting for chaos. Contemporary accounts and later histories show that Saudi Arabia often tried to use oil with gradations. Price first, then cuts, then wider pressure if Washington did not move. Iraq and Libya pushed harder. Saudi policy tried to keep room to escalate, which means the oil weapon matured as an instrument of calibration, not all at once, step by step. Why does that matter to you? Because a modern shortage would likely work the same way. Not as a clean global stop, as a layered sorting process. First price, then cover, then routing, then exemptions, and only at the end, for the least protected, the empty pump. Then Washington did what states almost always do in a shortage. It promised abundance later and control now. On November 7, Nixon unveiled Project Independence and pledged that by 1980 America would meet its own energy needs from its own resources. Apollo language. Manhattan Project language. National will. But inside the same emergency turn, the real instrument was not abundance. It was allocation authority. Richard Nixon addressed to the nation about policies to deal with the energy shortages, 1973. That split matters because Project Independence was the promise. The Emergency Petroleum Allocation Act was the operating system, and the statute sounded noble. Courts reproducing the Act's Section 4, Big 1. Show the official objectives, protect health and defense, preserve an economically sound and competitive petroleum industry, protect independent refiners and marketers, and distribute crude and products equitably among regions, sectors, and users. In other words, Washington was no longer just managing supply. It was trying to preserve a social order inside the oil system. Gulf Oil Corp v. Federal Energy Administration. Reproducing EPA objectives, 1975. Here's where the mechanism turns. By January 1974, the Federal Energy Office's mandatory allocation rules were already freezing commerce around old relationships and old dates. The regulations tied crude allocation to 1973 levels. They exempted some crude above those levels and some stripper well output, and in product pricing, firms ordered to resume supplying former customers had to fit them back into existing purchaser classes using May 15, 1973 base prices, rather than discover a new clearing price in an emergency. John C.C., Sawhill, Federal Energy Office, Mandatory Petroleum, Allocation Regulations, January 30, 1974. So the state did not abolish scarcity. It maps scarcity onto a frozen baseline. That sounds stabilizing until you think about incentives. If your refinery configuration had changed, if your customers had changed, if transport bottlenecks had shifted, if the most urgent need was no longer where it had been in May, the rules still pulled you backward. The Brookings economists Edward Erickson, Stephen Millsaps, and Robert Spann wrote in 1974 that U.S. price controls distorted the normal incentives that determine refinery output, kept crude below market clearing levels, and evolved into a two-tier system of old and new oil with exemptions and incentives that altered production decisions. Erickson, Millsaps, and Spann. Oil supply and tax incentives. 1974. And the result was not clean protection. It was administrative scarcity. William Poole later put it more bluntly. He argued that price controls and quantity allocations magnified the problems of the embargo. His numbers are revealing. By the end of March 1974, total petroleum inventories were about 6% above a year earlier, gasoline inventories about 7% higher, and distillate fuel oil inventories nearly 20% higher. The country was living through shortage theater with barrels still in the system. William Poole, Macroeconomic Policy, 1971-75. An appraisal, 1980. Why? Because once government promises fairness in a shortage, it has to decide whose claim is fair, and that is how stability becomes a hierarchy. Now move the crisis from Washington to the water, because in a modern oil shock, The decisive actor may not be a navy at all. It may be an underwriting committee in London. The Lloyd's Market Association's Joint War Committee maintains listed areas where vessels are considered at increased risk from war-related perils. And the current list still covers the Iranian zone that matters most for Gulf energy traffic. Enter those waters, and you may need additional war risk cover. Negotiated voyage by voyage. The committee does not set the price. It sets the flag that tells the market to start repricing fear. That sounds technical. It is not, because once a route moves into war risk logic, everything downstream starts to wobble. Hull cover, cargo cover, charter party rights, owner discretion, the standard BIMSO war risk clauses, as summarized by Skold, allow owners in some circumstances to refuse to proceed through a waterway where the vessel, crew, or cargo may be exposed to war risks. If charterers do not nominate a safer alternative within the allowed notice period, the cargo can be discharged elsewhere at their cost. Under the 2025 wording, some of those windows extend to 72 hours, so the barrel may still exist. The ship may still float. The contract may still fail. That is the hidden blockade, and you can see it in the recent record. On June 23, 2020 Thrive, Reuters reported that war risk insurance premiums for Gulf shipments rose to about 0.5% of vessel value from roughly 3% a week earlier, as fears around Hormuz escalated. Supertanker freight rates more than doubled to above $60,000 per day. In 2024, Red Sea war risk rates had spiked as high as 1%. Those numbers are not side effects. They are the transmission mechanism. And here is the most important nuance. Lloyd's said on March 23, 2026 that war insurance for Hormuz transits was still available, and that reduced traffic was being driven more by safety concerns than absolute insurance withdrawal. But it also said some fixed premium P&I covers for charterers had been canceled and mostly repriced. That is how modern paralysis often begins, not with a formal stop, with cover that becomes narrower, dearer, and more conditional, which means a 21st century shortage can start while the oil is still there, still pumped, still waiting. Here is the mistake people make in every oil panic. They imagine shortage as one number. It is not one number. It is a chain. A barrel has to be the right crude, reach the right refinery, move through the right units, come out as the right product, and then travel through the right distribution network. The Energy Information Administration's plain language explanation makes the core point. Refineries do not simply use oil. They separate, convert, and treat it into different outputs. And refinery complexity matters. Some plants can do far more conversion than others. That means two refineries receiving the same crude are not necessarily producing the same rescue. Washington knew this in 1974. It is sitting there in the paperwork. In the January 30 Federal Register, the Federal Energy Office required refiners seeking crude under the buy-sell system to identify the name and location of the refinery, the amount of crude sought, and the technical specification range of crude oil that refinery could process. That is an admission in legal form. Not all oil is interchangeable, and not all refineries are either. So even when barrels still exist, the choke point may sit downstream, at the cracker, at the coker, at the pipeline header. And once that happens, officials start ranking users. The Federal Energy Office's own 1974 allocation summary said motor gasoline priority levels were set at 100% of current requirements for bulk end users, including agricultural production, emergency services, energy production, sanitation, telecommunications, public transportation, and cargo freight, and mail hauling. It also created a 3% state set aside for motor gasoline to handle emergency and hardship cases. In the same hearing record, FEO officials described states exercising complete discretion over those set-aside barrels, and the national gasoline allocation fraction for February 1974 averaged 84. 2%, with Maine at 76% and Minnesota at 93%. 8%. Scarcity was national, access was local. That is why the public sees rationing only at the end of the process. By then, the hierarchy already exists. New Jersey's answer was mandatory odd-even purchases by license plate number, a ban on topping off if your tank was already at least half full, and colored station flags telling drivers whether fuel remained. The line at the pump looked democratic. It was not. The categories had already been chosen upstream, and here is the buried social detail. Once priority language appears, constituencies rush to fit inside it. In March 1974, Avery C. Upchurch of the North Carolina Service Station Association reported that commercial establishments were installing private pumps and tanks because, under FEO rules, they could apply as priority users and be assigned suppliers. That is how a shortage stops being only an energy event. It becomes a classification contest. E-Verify, strongest named industrial carve-out archival case. So who wins first in a real shortage? Not the producer, the operator already sitting inside the choke point. Now bring the pattern into 2026. The Strait of Hormuz still carries the kind of volume that can turn a regional conflict into a global sorting exercise. In 2024, about 20 million barrels per day move through it, roughly 20% of global petroleum liquids consumption, and around 20% of global LNG trade also passed through that same corridor, primarily from Qatar. The EIA estimates 83% of the LNG moving through Hormuz in 2024 went to Asian markets, so a closure does not spread like a fog. It lands by dependency. First on shipping, then on gas buyers, then on refiners, then on you, Candace Dunn and Justine Barden, EIA. Amid regional conflict, the Strait of Hormuz remains critical oil choke point. 2025. EIA. About 1/5 of global liquefied natural gas trade flows through the Strait of Hormuz. 2025. And countries do not enter that shock equally prepared. The IEA system requires at least 90 days of net imports. EU law requires 90 days of net imports, or 61 days of consumption, whichever is higher. But the politically important number is not the legal minimum. It is the usable cushion, the release mechanism, and who gets priority once stocks start moving. Verify precise reserve day figures by country. That is the endgame officials almost never say out loud. If they allow honest prices, you get visible pain early. Demand falls. Consumption adjusts. The signal is brutal, but real. If they suppress the signal, the adjustment comes later through something worse. The Federal Reserve's own history says the 1981-82 recession was triggered by tight monetary policy to fight inflation. The St. Quote, Louis Fed puts it even more plainly. Volcker's medicine led to 2 recessions before prices stabilized. Tim Sablik, Recession of 1981-82, Federal Reserve History. William Poole, The Great Inflation. Volcker taught us many lessons, 2005. So that is the binary choice. Either authorities permit the price system to tell the truth, or they postpone the truth until recession tells it for them.